All right, let's talk a little bit about Watergate, one of the biggest political scandals in the history of the United States. To first talk about Watergate, you have to kind of get to know Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon was a little bit of a different animal. He was, by all accounts, a self-made man, came from a pretty humble background, scrapped, was a really good student, very, very, very smart. Got a full ride to college, eventually ended up at Duke Law School, where he worked really hard to pay his way through and make it. By all accounts, like I said, a very smart individual. Was Vice President of the United States under Dwight Eisenhower. Richard Nixon also has a little bit of a dark side. In 1960, he ran for president, and he lost to eventual winner John F. Kennedy. Remember we talked about John F. Kennedy. In the 1960 election, there was a lot of things that went on. A lot of allegations of voter fraud, people voting that were dead, that didn't exist, that weren't real people, that were fictional cartoon characters, like all these kind of weird people voting multiple times, just all these kind of things. The $20 handshakes in West Virginia, claiming that Kennedy's dad, who was extremely wealthy, was handing out like just money for votes. There was a story that came out, Richard Nixon on his way back to California, his home, after the 1960 election, turned to an aide and said, "I'm never going to get played like that again." Kind of in regards to he felt he got a little swindled out of the election. Now, that's not to say that he wasn't doing some of those things too. Oftentimes when somebody wins, you don't look at what the person that lost did. But it looked like Kennedy might have been involved in some shenanigans around that election. So a little background on Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon was not very easy with people. As a politician, that's an unusual trait to have. The story goes that when people would go see Richard Nixon, he would have notes of things to talk about, like, "Sam, I will talk about basketball with you because you like basketball." Or he'd literally have like almost like a script. Like he wasn't very good at thinking off the cuff of making small talk. So he was not a very easy conversationalist. He also did not trust people at all. He taped every conversation he had in the Oval Office, every phone conversation. Just he wanted a record of what people were telling him and didn't really trust anybody. Had a little, like I said, a little bit of a dark side where he was not afraid to blackmail people or use like the power of the presidency to kind of get after people. Cross me, maybe the IRS finds a little tax problem that you had. So he was not afraid to throw the teeth of the government at somebody. Richard Nixon also had an enemies list. As one kind of close aide said, anybody that has that many enemies that they need to make a list has too many enemies. And he did have an enemies list of people that he wanted to get back at. And he'd keep files on things and things that he'd find out about people, like, I could use this against you later if you cross me. So, not necessarily the nicest guy in the world. Richard Nixon ran for president in 1968, won, like we mentioned. In 1972, he was running for re-election. Ran against a guy by the name of George McGovern. Now, Richard Nixon was winning the election huge, like landslide proportions. Never really was in doubt of losing this election. Now, in the summer of 1972, there was a break-in in the Watergate Hotel, which just so happens to be the Democratic headquarters. And lo and behold, 5 men were arrested. 5 men were arrested that, just it was a weird situation. One of which happened to be somebody that worked for the CIA, had like contacts at the White House, but really the story was never really connected to the president or top administration, and by and large was really kind of ignored by people. Just kind of is this weird, odd story, like why in the world would people break into the Democratic the Democratic headquarters? As it turns out, the president was very, very involved. And the ironic thing of this whole matter is clearly they were doing it, they were breaking in to get political secrets that they could use against the Democrats, but they didn't need it. It's kind of like saying, we're going to cheat in a game that we're winning by a gigantic amount for. Like, what? You don't need to do that at that point, for sure. The president had a group of people known as the aides, kind of known as the plumbers. The plumbers were people that would stop up leaks. So he was very paranoid about people in the administration leaking information. So the plumbers were people that would stop leaks, that would go out and find dirty secrets on people, and they could kind of use at a later date. One of these plumbers was a guy by the name of John Ehrlichman, who was a very, very close aide of President Richard Nixon. As it turns out, and we're going to learn this later, was kind of the one controlling the plumbers. Now, the plumbers, not only did they work on like the Watergate hearings, they worked on some other big stories. Like there was a guy by the name of Daniel Ellsberg who obtained some papers known as the Pentagon Papers that kind of showed all of these things that were done by the government that was misleading to the American people during the Vietnam War. Now, these papers ended up in the hands of the New York Times, who printed those papers and kind of exposed to the world, like, hey, the government's not being entirely truthful. This is a big Supreme Court case that, again, ended up in the Supreme Court. And the government basically said, like, hey, New York Times, you're not allowed to do that. The Supreme Court, in a pretty historic ruling, one that you'll need to know for AP government, so file this away for later. In a pretty historic ruling, the Supreme Court basically said the New York Times absolutely did have the right to publish those papers. They weren't stolen. Now, the government claimed they violated national security, and the New York Times, like, they did not violate national security. So they said that they, and this is kind of the big part, not only did they have the right to publish those papers, they should, and they have really an obligation to publish those papers. Because that's what the media is for, is to hold kind of government accountable and expose, like, anytime they're trying to fool or kind of pull one over on the people. Now, the Supreme Court did say in a case of national security that, yeah, they would be kind of no-go. But there was no national security here. Now, during this time, Nixon also kind of gets in trouble for a couple other things. This idea of impoundment, again, another thing kind of from government. Impoundment basically is, there's all these programs that were being passed, and Nixon's like, I don't like these. So basically he ordered the directors of these offices and these programs to not spend the money they were given by Congress. A thing known as impoundment, which is illegal. You really can't do that. Okay, so really, really not allowed to do. All right, now let's go back to the Watergate. Like I said, the Watergate was a break-in of the Democratic National headquarters. 5 men were arrested. Now, as this was kind of getting a little bit of media coverage, by and large, most of the media bought into there's nothing here. This really isn't a conspiracy. It's 5 kind of weird guys just figuring this out. John Dean, who was the head White House counsel, did his investigation. John Dean was a younger-looking guy who, by all accounts, everybody kind of said looks like a Boy Scout. And John Dean did his investigation and kind of declared there's nothing there. There's no connection to the White House or Richard Nixon. This is kind of a done deal. Now, like I said, the media pretty much bought it with the exception of a couple outlets. The Washington Post being one, and the most important one. They had 2 young reporters by the name of Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein that were on the story. And they're the ones that kind of broke this story wide open and really made their careers, truth be told. You're going to see them will pop up on CNN and all kinds of news channels talking about presidential scandals. It's by and large based on that one set of reporting in the 1970s, breaking the Watergate story. Okay. In January of 1973, these 5 guys go on trial. Now, because of Woodward and Bernstein, they do start to connect it a little bit to some government officials. So the 5 burglars plus government officials, G. Gordon Liddy and Howard Hunt, go on trial. All of them pled guilty, so they're prepared to take the fall for what went on. Again, everybody in the White House probably is like, this is a good deal. The judge in the trial was not like willing to accept their guilty plea. Like, he kind of pushed them a little bit more. He had the nickname Maximum John, and that's not for being easy on defendants. So all of a sudden, one of the defendants cracked and started spilling the beans. Basically, he admitted to protecting other government officials, kind of started talking about maybe some of the cover-up, and this kind of broke the story open. Again, this combined with Woodward and Bernstein's reporting really kind of is starting to break the story open. Now, Woodward and Bernstein had a pretty notorious secret source known only as Deep Throat, because apparently very scared of retribution. He was a really high-ranking government official. He didn't want his identity to be known, so he kept on giving like Woodward and Bernstein these little tips to kind of connect the dots. In one of his famous quotes, he told Woodward and Bernstein to follow the money, that there was a trail of money, that the money would connect him back to the guilty party. And that's really what the reporters did, is they followed the money trail. They realized that some of these burglars were paid $25,000, and they started tracing back from their account, where did this $25,000 come from? And then, again, things kind of mushroom as they do, implicating more and more people. Now, as this happens, as these people are spilling the beans, Woodward and Bernstein are breaking stories, the White House is trying to close ranks. John Ehrlichman, one of the big White House aides, and another big White House aide, H.R. Haldeman, both resign. John Dean, the White House counsel, is fired. So now all of a sudden, all these people are starting to arouse suspicion. Like, how much did the White House really know? How much did Richard Nixon know? And again, a lot of supporters are still refusing to believe that Nixon kind of knew anything. In the summer of 1973, there's a lot of Senate hearings that kind of go on that are televised nationally that start to link government officials. Attorney General John Mitchell, who's the highest ranking official as far as the Justice Department, is linked to knowing of these dirty tricks. He was said to be in a meeting with G. Gordon Liddy, who was working with the plumbers, that was kind of letting him know like all the things that they were going to do. So that was kind of a big deal. John Dean also, during the White House counsel that was fired during the Senate, these Senate hearings, connects Richard Nixon to the cover-up. That's not a good thing. Now, still, the people that support Richard Nixon are of the belief that, hey, they don't have much of anything. It's one guy who got fired versus the President of the United States. It's one guy versus another guy. Like, who do you believe? Now, the Senate also came to realize that Richard Nixon had these tapes from the White House, tapes that he had all these conversations. So the special prosecutor that was hired by the White House, a guy by the name of Archibald Cox, asked Richard Nixon to turn over the tapes. Richard Nixon refuses, claims the right of what's called executive privilege, which basically means the president has the right to keep certain things private, like just they're his property. So he refuses to turn these over. In the meantime, this is kind of a separate incident, but doesn't help him out any. Richard Nixon's Vice President Spiro Agnew gets embroiled in a different controversy where he's basically is proven to have accepted some bribes, so he resigns. That doesn't help any when in a separate incident you have one of your top-ranking guys like breaking these laws. That's no good. Now, Spiro Agnew resigns, and Gerald Ford is appointed as the new vice president. Gerald Ford, from Michigan, by the way, is seen as a pretty likable guy, pretty trustworthy guy, so kind of the perfect guy to get in there. Richard Nixon offers the written transcripts of some of his tapes. Archibald Cox declines. Because he declines, Richard Nixon gets a little leery, and he fires Archibald Cox in an event known as the Saturday Night Massacre. This invokes a lot of negativity, a ton of negativity, where people all across the country are just raging against the complete corruption that's going on. This looks awful. There's 150,000 telegrams that come in. They're saying what's going on. People are demanding, people will lose their jobs and investigation of the president. It's just not a good situation. I'm going to stop the video here. We're going to connect it because I'm running out of time. So I'm going to come back with part 2 in a minute.